have with me Tom Ritchie, who is an investment director at Cibus. Cibus invests in food and agribusiness with a private equity strategy and real assets, i.e. sometimes owning farms or growing businesses, and also a venture capital strategy, and is developing a natural capital investment strategy. And it's obviously in our portfolio, which is why we're up here. Tom, maybe if you give us a little bit more background on Cibus, and then very briefly yourself, and then we'll go into questions if that works.
Yeah, happily, thank you. So we are a food and ag-focused investment platform. We've got 3 strategies across venture capital, real asset, and then private equity. We're based in London. We have an international mandate. We focus more on Western Europe, North America, and we have 2 colleagues in Australia. For us, it's about driving sustainability across the food and agriculture supply chain. And we're driving financial returns, but crucially not at the cost of ESG. In fact, we see the opportunity to drive real impact through agriculture. It's a sector that has huge structural inefficiencies, and we're out there to solve for that by leveraging technology and transitioning the food supply chain.
Great. And then Cibus is working on a natural capital investment strategy. That's a very hot topic these days. Do you want to explain a bit more about what you mean or what we mean by natural capital, and maybe why it's such a hot topic and such a buzzword at the moment?
Happily, and I'll try and make it relevant to our investment strategies. But natural capital is quite a broad definition. Effectively, it's looking at the world's natural resources across geology, soil, air, water, biomass, living organisms. It has an economic value of around 44 trillion. 50% of the world's global output is directly correlated to natural capital. The problem is mankind has largely destroyed it over the course of the Industrial Revolution, and we're now having to find ways to resolve that. When we look at our real asset strategy, this is where we're investing in large-scale agricultural production. It's all about regenerative farming. You can farm in a sustainable manner and still drive yields. You don't have to be looking at high input models that have a detrimental impact on the environment. So we're all about leveraging technology, precision applications to reduce input application, transitioning from traditional synthetic chemicals to biological alternatives, looking at intercropping where you can provide high quality production, but also alongside biodiversity. When we look at the private equity strategy, it's around companies that we're investing in that are delivering the type of returns we need, but also have material environmental positive impact. So, for example, we've invested in tree nurseries. These are nurseries that are producing young trees for sustainable woodland, which is driving carbon sequestration, also supporting biodiversity. It's an area of the industry, of the supply chain that a lot of people haven't really looked at before. It's heavily fragmented. It's ripe for disruption in terms of consolidation, technology, and we're actively doing that. So not only are we driving the financial returns, but with the 2 assets that we've acquired in the latest fund, over the course of the investment, based on the number of trees that they will be producing, we believe they will be sequestering in around 20 to 25 years, 200 million tons of carbon. So it's having a huge impact on both the carbon sequestration and the biodiversity. And then when we look at the venture capital strategy, this is where we're looking at technology that is helping to address a number of areas. So we're looking at precision applications again. We have 2 robotics companies. One reduces the amount of chemical applications by 90% in the field, which has a significant impact in terms of reducing the level of chemicals that are spread, but also in terms of cost savings and ROI for the farmer. We have a robotic company that is using ultraviolet light to treat fungal infections in soft fruit. Again, these farmers are being able to substitute up to 100% of their chemical applications. They can run an autonomous function where they have robots working 24 hours a day, and then you can stack in other areas of integrated pest management, harvesting, weeding, and you drive a very compelling return to the grower. And then looking at technology around monitoring, reporting, verification. So being able to look at how we can drive environmental impact assessments, looking at the evolution of the voluntary carbon and biodiversity markets, and providing the tools and services to be able to monetize those. And then more lastly, looking across other verticals, again, focusing on crop health, looking at biologicals, looking at the latest technology, anything that is helping to address structural inefficiencies that drive impact.
And to maybe take an example and bring it to life a little bit more, Cibus recently acquired a Dutch business that grows tomatoes in sort of high-tech glass houses with energy coming from geothermal sources and solar sources. And can you fill us in a little bit about the thesis behind that, and around controlled environment agriculture more broadly, and then also why this particular business and this particular facility is so cutting edge. And this facility has actually been featured in a documentary with David Attenborough. It's on Netflix, so look that up afterwards if you want.
Yeah, happily. So the Flavour Farm is the strategy. Diverstein is the first asset we acquired. It's 25 hectares of state-of-the-art glasshouse in the Netherlands. It's producing 16,500 tonnes of tomatoes every year. In terms of the ESG aspects, 85% of the water that is used is recaptured and recycled. We're using a fraction of the amount of energy that other glasshouse, sort of mid-tech, low-tech producers are using, around 44%. We are using 90% of our energy in terms of heat production from geothermal. And what that means is that we have a significantly lower carbon footprint versus other areas of controlled environment agriculture, but we're still being able to deliver high quality products, consistent products, pretty much all year round, and delivering phenomenal yields. And I think what's interesting is when you look at the controlled environment sector, particularly in the Netherlands, which is leading, they're producing 50% of the tomatoes that are being produced in Spain and Morocco, but they're using an eighth of the area of land. And this is where controlled environment agriculture really comes into its own. And it's hugely dependent on the type of energy models you have. Obviously, if you're using conventional energy systems, you're more exposed to input prices. And what's happened with volatility over the course of the last 5 years has really hurt a lot of producers. But by being able to de-risk using geothermal and sustainable energy, not only can you drive a real environmental impact, but you can de-risk your financial exposure as well. And I think that is really important. But there's a huge variation in the efficiency of controlled environment, ranging from very basic sort of polytunnels, which lends little value in terms of climate control, right through to the glass houses like Diverstein. It's also very different to indoor farming, which is really an area of farming that requires a huge amount of energy. The cost base attributed to vertical farming is significant. You need to be producing high volumes of premium products. There's a lot of off-take risk, and you're not exposed to the natural benefits of sunlight, which obviously glass houses are. So there are various pros and cons, but certainly from the work that we've done in terms of looking at the economic profile of Diverstein, we're producing an EBITDA margin of around 37% versus other comparable companies of around sort of 19%. So significantly higher margins.
Okay. And if you think more broadly about producers moving to or trying to adopt more sustainable practices in farming and agriculture, what are some of the barriers to that, and what are some of the things that can really make more sense for them to go faster?
Yeah, so I think access to capital is one of them. So for a lot of farmers, and it does depend on what type of farming you're doing, but if you take soft fruit producers, for example, in the UK, they've had a pretty torrid time of it because the retailers have been squeezing margins. They've had huge inflation on input costs, and therefore they don't have the deep pockets to go out there and really invest in technology. And this technology, if they can afford it, can be instrumental in terms of driving operating efficiencies and returns. What we're now seeing is more and more money coming in through venture capital investing into agri-tech, where they're offering more service-based models, which make it more affordable for farmers to get access to these products and services and to use them on a sort of per-use basis. And also grant subsidies. There's a lot of money now, particularly in the UK, as we transition away from the CAP model into providing support for farmers to embrace technology, and also technology that's going to drive positive environmental impact.
Everyone in the audience is a consumer, and I assume probably wants to try and do the right thing in terms of sustainability. But sometimes it can be hard to know what to do when you're in a supermarket. Based on what you've seen with growing businesses and on farms and in supply chains from farms, are there things you would pick out and say, always go for this type of product, or don't really do that because it's all greenwashing?
Yeah. So, I mean, we waste, 9.5 million tons of food every year, and that has an economic value of 14 billion. Yeah, and if we were to repurpose that food, it would feed another 30 million people. We've got 8.5 million people on the bread line. So people need to eat in moderation. They need to focus on raw ingredients. We need to be looking at origin. Now, it's not easy to always work out where food comes from, and this is where reference that was made during the Circularity Capital interview around sort of traceability is going to be really important. Providing consumers with access to data that helps them to quickly understand where is their food coming from. But certainly eating less. So when it comes to meat, meat has a very negative connotation in terms of methane emissions, carbon. But actually, if you focus on higher welfare, quality, low intensive, so free range production, it's very different. In actual fact, you can have a regenerative, sustainable model around meat if you farm in that way, which is actually sort of net neutral in terms of environment. And then looking at things like palm oil and other products, cocoa, which is actively contributing to deforestation. We're losing 10 football fields of trees every minute. And things like that, I think, is to be aware of. But it's quite hard, unless you're going to really read labels. And there's also a socio-economic component to this and an educational piece. But I would say certainly focusing on ingredients, seasonal products, shorter supply chains, and making more from less.
Maybe questions from the audience?
What are your thoughts about investment going into companies who are hacking biology and creating food from a petri dish and seeing that as the sustainable route forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's all I eat. It's an interesting one. I have to confess, we have investments in cellular meat, but very specific investments. I think there's a huge distinction between gene editing, where the sort of risks associated with that are far less than genetic modification. But inevitably, I mean, it all comes down to the sort of regulatory frameworks around that and ensuring that everything is tried and tested. I personally don't have an issue with gene editing when I think about what can be done from a biological standpoint versus the alternative in terms of the amount of chemicals that are needed to create the same effect. And if there's no detrimental or negative impact on humans or the environment, then surely it's a good thing. So I think it's something to be approached with caution and with the right regulatory framework around it and certification standards. But in principle, yes, that's where we're heading.
Thank you. So in the UK, there's a movement thinking much more about biodiversity. Certainly landowners are thinking much more about biodiversity net gain. It seemed like you were looking at some models or some mechanisms for being able to measure that. There are loads of different emerging ways of doing it. It would be interesting to hear how you're thinking that through and how you're choosing your winners.
So I think in England's the first country to put it into a statutory framework. So it's actually part of the Environment Bill that came into effect earlier this year. So there is a clearly defined BNG metric. And so you can use what was developed by DEFRA to go and work out what the environmental impact is on a piece of land for development. And that's, you know, something that's already being regulated. I guess where there's opportunity to really expand this internationally is more in the voluntary market. And that's where we're seeing more and more sort of interest. And that's where you need to have really accurate monitoring, reporting, and verification. But it needs to be done at scale and cost effectively. The problem at the moment is a lot of the baselining is very, you know, capital intensive. It costs a lot to sample and it's very human intensive. Whereas when you start to use, you know, 3D imagery, LiDAR systems, satellite data in combination with like eDNA technology, that's when you can get the same level of accuracy without having to go and doing sort of quite the level or the volume of sampling that's currently being done. So that's certainly what's happening. And you know, when you look at soil carbon, it's the same trend. But certainly in England, it's an interesting space, the BNG market. And you know, there are only a few units on the market at the moment, but a lot of landowners and projects are going to be coming forward.
In England specifically, housing developments now, and this was sort of phased in for different sizes of housing developments, but it now applies to basically most housing developments, have to take into account biodiversity loss and create an equivalent amount of gain, at least. And there's a mechanism to try to start a market effectively for biodiversity net gain credits, which is potentially going to be a very interesting space. And it's, I'm quite surprised. It seems like a pretty well-written, well-thought-through piece of legislation, which I have to say I was a bit surprised at.
Yeah, I know. It's an interesting. I mean, in terms of like the value assigned to that market, it's between sort of 165 to 240 million is what Natural England are sort of working towards. But as you say, it's a statutory requirement now. There's a defined metric. The market is evolving, and at the moment, units are trading between sort of 27 to 40,000. And then there's an environmental covenant on that over 30 years, so you can't do anything to that land for 30 years apart from maintain it for the biodiversity uplift.
Any other questions?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting talk. How do you ensure that there's genuine additionality in the investments you make? I mean, you talked about nurseries and the sequestration of carbon, but I was thinking, well, that would happen if you didn't own those nurseries, and those nurseries would probably be there regardless of whether you invested in them, or if they weren't, there would be other nurseries because people are going to buy the same number of trees, probably. And you know, how do you ensure that the impact that so you're driving impact through actually getting hold of the things that are causing change to happen? So, you know, rather than, so for example, if somebody chooses to buy fruit from a certain country of origin that's nearer, that may or may not actually drive a change in sourcing. It may simply replace something that would have been bought from somewhere else. You know, there may be other changes up the supply chain that simply cancel it out. You know, how can you make sure your investments are having a real impact and not simply being offset elsewhere?
Okay, so without making it too sort of portfolio company specific, the way that we approach this is we have an in-house ESG team. So when we look at prospective investment, we will do our full ESG due diligence. So we will effectively baseline the company and work out what it is at day one when we acquire the asset. And then we develop an environmental and social action plan, which will set out key milestones so that we can deliver, you know, material, quantifiable ESG improvements. And you know, additionality is a key part of that. And I think when we're looking at opportunities, you know, it is a core focus for us. And then it comes down to looking at what is the relevant certification standard that is being used for maybe biodiversity or carbon, and making sure that whatever we do adheres to those requirements. So it's very case by case, but as a firm, that's how we approach it.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.